Okay, we are joined today by Father Thomas Joseph White. Very excited to have this conversation. Father, thanks for taking time to be here.
Hey, thanks so much. It's great to be on the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So you have this new book out. I'll see if I can show it with the virtual background. I might have to take it off, but it's a great volume called Principles of Catholic Theology, Book 2, on the rational credibility of Christianity. Now, I want to dive into the content as quickly as possible because it's a big book. There's lots of good stuff in here, and I want to explore as much as we can in our time together. But first, we'll do a little bit of background. This book is book 2 of our larger series, of course. So, yeah, tell us about that series. What prompted you to write this, and what is it all about?
Well, so it's a series in a way of articles that are on themes. It's kind of an homage, as I say in the introduction to the first book, to the kind of explorations that were done in theology after the Second Vatican Council by the famous theologians, the Ratzingers, Rahners, Balthazars, and Lonergans of the world. And without any pretense to join that crowd, what I'm trying to show is that there are still things to explore in Thomistic theology, in terms of its contemporary significance. And so I'm assembling kind of studies, tentative explorations and articles in different areas, suggesting both how to retrieve teachings from St. Thomas and also move forward into new fields of exploration or conversation. The first book's on what theology is, and it's really about the inner intelligibility of the mysteries of God and the study of the mystery of the Trinity and of all things in light of the Trinity. But then the second book, which is a companion volume, which is what you're holding there, is a complete monograph, really more than it is articles. It's a complete single work or book on the rational credibility of Christianity. So it's like, in light of the revelation of the Trinity, can one responsibly and reasonably embrace Trinitarian faith? The embrace of faith is given to us by grace, but the act of belief by grace is not contrary to natural reason and to sound philosophical and scientific knowledge. So how to articulate that compatibility of faith and reason? And so this book's more heavily philosophical, thinking about ways that you can defend the rational credibility of Christianity in the light of divine revelation. And then the third book, which is coming out very soon, actually, is on studies on Trinitarian theology, creation, and Christology. And then there'll be a very large fourth volume on ecclesiology, nature and grace, and Mariology. So those are the series is currently appointed.
Okay, so not too busy then. Good.
Yeah, exactly.
So obviously, this book has a lot to say on arguments for the existence of God and philosophical anthropology. So let's get right into it. I'll ask a stage setting question first. When we talk about the rational credibility of of not even Christian belief yet, I guess we could just say theism or classical theism. What do we mean by that? Because I see like different levels of sort of aggression here, right? Like there's the lowest level, which is say, okay, it's reasonable to believe this. Like you're not violating any like obvious norms of rationality. And that to me seems like totally easy, right? There's a, and in fact, that's what a lot of naturalists are kind of up to, at least not on the popular level, but like the more sophisticated naturalists are just saying, hey, this is why I'm not crazy to be a naturalist.
Yeah.
Here's why I don't think your theistic arguments compel me to be a theist. So just leave me alone, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe, and not say that's a useless project, because a lot of people think that it is unreasonable to believe in God. So that's actually a very useful project, but it's I think a very modest one. Then there's more, I guess, aggressive positions where it's more reasonable to be a theist than a naturalist. And then there's the most aggressive position was like, if you're not a theist, you are unreasonable, right? It's just irrational to not be a theist. Where do you fall on that scale? What do you think is what's the kind of case you're making? Mm-hmm.
Well, in chapter one, I'm more in the beginning of chapter one. I'm sort of in the first part of what you just denoted. Saying, it's not obvious that the Naturalist Project is going to give us a satisfactory explanation of things, and in fact, it looks antecedently probable that the monotheistic account is going to be the only thing that really generates a satisfying explanation for why we are or how we are. And then I look at a more aggressive, I think, set of scenarios where I suggest that there are ways to rule out unreasonable forms of religiosity. And I posit real questions about, I say in some ways a Christian intellectual is an atheist because there's a lot of gods or visions of God they don't believe in. and I try to problematize views of God as totally and wholly impersonal, or radically pantheistic understandings of the relationship between God and creation, as well as kind of mutabalist theories of God as somehow depending on creation. And I also then rule out, certain ways of believing in divine revelation that I think are probably don't meet the standards of rationality. I say, I give examples. I mean, I'm certainly more critical of say Mormon ideas of revelation than I am Muslim views, but I'm, concerned about both. And then I'm saying, well, this actually invites a lot of scrutiny about Christianity as well, because, maybe there's no reasonable claims about revelation. So that's sort of where I then articulate views of the First Vatican Council. Say, well, if there is rational belief in monotheism and revelation, it has to meet certain standards, high standards. And then the second chapter, I do then argue for the existence of God and for the immateriality and subsistence of the personal soul of the human person. So at that point, I'm really saying it's unreasonable not to believe in God. And I go back and I look at scientism in that light and say, well, scientism is a kind of an intellectual failure to take seriously the metaphysical questions the universe poses to us. And then in the third chapter, I don't argue that a rational person must embrace Trinitarian faith. I only argue that it's entirely conceptually coherent and historically defensible to believe in the mystery of the Trinity. And then I try to, in the fourth chapter, argue for the sort of motive of belief in the Trinity in terms of the Catholic promise of the grace of the beatific vision, the hope of actually encountering God in this life as God is in himself, not just knowing God philosophically through effects, but knowing God in himself in this life by grace and in the life to come by vision, and saying, well, that's actually philosophically interesting. The idea that you could acquire the knowledge of God, not just through the medium of effects, but in himself. So I'd say as the book goes on, it gets stronger and stronger. But I'm never claiming that you can get from an argument of philosophical nature into the supernatural act of faith by grace. But I am saying that there's not a more reasonable stance toward the explanation of the world than theism. In fact, theism is a compelling philosophical stance. So, I mean, I make strong argument that there's demonstrative knowledge of God.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay, all right. That's it's always good to have the proper expectations, and I'm certainly with you on, on all that, Father. So let me maybe frame where we're going to head this way. So it strikes me that if somebody is a naturalist, there's probably one of two reasons why they are a naturalist, and maybe it's a combination of both, right? And there's really the two reasons that Aquinas considers. I do think they're still the two best arguments for naturalism.
Yeah.
One is that we don't need God to explain anything, right? The principles of nature are enough. So yeah, right. We can just cut off that supernatural lump. We can explain everything as a naturalist that the theist can explain, and we don't have that extra ontological burden, something like that, right? And the mode of explanation, and I think this is important and often forgotten, has to be committed to a broad form of scientism, something like a combinatorial mode of explanation where it's the atoms and the laws we use to combine them to make sense of everything, right? And I think if you venture outside of that and you start, bringing things into your naturalistic worldview that are kind of spooky to explain certain features of the world, I just want to call foul on that, right? We can circle back to that in a minute. And then the other reason is the problem of evil, right? That, hey, if you have this perfect being at the sort of basement of reality, right? Wouldn't we expect a much better world than this or something like that? And when I talk to naturalists, and when I even think about my own time when I would have considered myself a naturalist, honestly, it was kind of more the first one for me than the second one. I didn't really start thinking about the problem of evil as much until I actually started considering theism. Then it actually became a lot more pressing. So it seems like this book is largely considered with that first motivation for naturalism at first. I haven't read the whole book yet. Do you get to the problem of evil in this book? Is it something you touch on at all?
No, I would say I don't really engage with it deeply in this book. And although, I mean, in the first chapter, I'm interested in identifying what goodness is, which I think is a more fundamental question than the moral outrage in regard to natural and moral evils that we encounter in the world, or the anti-theistic intuitions that can give rise to. I mean, there's a more fundamental issue before we talk about God or human persons, and that's just what we mean by goodness. And what is evil? Is evil a privation of goodness, as the classical, both Hellenistic and Christian philosophers have argued? Which I do believe that's the only good way to understand evil.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you that those are the two strongest arguments for the gratuity of the hypothesis of God, the kind of in prima facie implausibility of belief in religious meaning to the universe, or to human existence. And I, um, try to problematize the first of those more, especially in this book. I mean, the problem of evil is a kind of topic so massive or so intensive that it requires almost, I'd say, a book,
Entire book by itself. Yeah.
a
Right.
book on
Mm-hmm.
its own. And there are also more things written on that than I think what I'm doing here. Um, it's also the case that a lot of people in the systematic theology guild want to look at the problem of evil, especially in light of incarnation, passion, resurrection,
Right.
and eschatology, and not only in light of the philosophical queries. Although I think you need to do both. It's a both and rather than an either or.
Yeah.
But what I try to look at in this work is, what are objects of knowledge that permit us to step outside of scientism, as you mentioned. The idea that really the only forceful and truth-telling explanations of reality are provided by modern physics, chemistry, and biology, the mathematization of the universe, and the instrumental measuring and study of component material parts on the micro or macro level, uh, in regard to a natural history of the cosmos and a contemporary study of material processes. Now, I mean, I'm pretty pro science on all fronts, but I don't think that can be the only way to study what reality is, and that's why I introduce objects of knowledge like being and existence, unity and multiplicity, truth, falsehood, goodness, the privation of good we call evil, beauty, and ugliness, as ways of thinking more fundamentally about reality that I think are at the heart even of the scientific, or if you like, positive approach to empirical reality, because you always have to kind of presume and engage with the existence, intelligibility, relative perfection or imperfection, um, and therefore goodness or lack thereof of natural realities. And even beauty can be studied, I think, more objectively than subjectively. So once you start to let's say acknowledge that those topics, the so-called transcendentals of being, uh, truth or intelligibility in things themselves, goodness and beauty, are real, then there's a whole set of questions that open up that aren't opened up. You might say you're not permitted to ask them or discuss them unless you can acknowledge those objects of truth, of reality, of knowledge. But if you can't acknowledge those, and those questions do open up, then I mean, I really think that theism becomes uh, a rather prominent, comes to the forefront as a very prominent way in which we can pose the question of the simplest explanation of things. So one of the reasons that the first of your two issues, naturalism as total explanation, is appealing is that it purportedly would give us the simplest and most comprehensive explanation. But what I argue in the book is that just boiling things down to natural particles and their intelligible framework of associations, their types, and various causal alignments, it's actually still a pretty complicated view of the world, because that reality just is.
Mm-hmm.
That reality just does generate more complex things, and that those complex things just aren't really explicable as more complex or as anything other than haphazard. And chance is not a very powerful explanation of reality.
Yeah, so I think that a point you're getting at, I just want to highlight it here, right? Is even if you take this form of naturalism, and granted, naturalism is sort of like Ben and Jerry's these days. There's a whole bunch of different flavors out there, right? But this is kind
Yeah.
of a common form of it, right? That seems right to me. That sort of whatever is at the basement is not only going to be sort of arbitrarily complex, whatever it is, whatever those the physical entities or entity is that's at the basement of the sort of naturalistic theory, is not only going to be arbitrarily complex, but it's going to be brutally existing and not relevantly different from all the other sorts of things that we think just shouldn't be brutally existing, right? And that to me is a significant cost in terms of theoretical complexity and explanatory comprehensiveness, right? And not only that, but I think if you proceed from that starting point, it's also hard to see how it isn't like aggressively eliminativist. And here is where
Yeah.
you just sort of can look to many other naturalists and say, okay, if we're explaining, certain relevant phenomena that need to be explained from this approach, whether it's human consciousness or the moral dimension, we really wind up explaining them away. And this is why you have, so many naturalists who I think are fairly consistent within the inner logic of the system, who just really say that these phenomena just aren't what they seem, right? They're
Yeah.
nihilists, they're eliminativists, and stuff like that. So that might be a problem, right? Because then you might wonder if you're actually getting a good explanation. Um,
Yeah,
if that,
there are some very curious things. You get rid of the mind, but the problem is, of course, we're worried about the truth of things because truth really is a kind of relation of the mind to the nature of reality, or reality is understood in its intelligibility. So you don't want to eliminate the mind because you need to be a truth person if you're going to be arguing vehemently for materialism or naturalism or um, fundamental explanations. So you don't want to get rid of mind. You just need to. So you're going to have to provide some kind of account of what mind is in relation to the truth of things. That's in purely naturalistic and materialist, a material in a particularly naturalistic and materialist framework. And you're going to have to come up with some theory of universals because you need a theory of natural kinds. You need a theory, I think, of essences and properties
I
of
think, yeah.
causation. You're going to need to be a causal realist. It's real. Once you start down that road, though, it's real hard to do that without reintroducing elements of classical metaphysics. And once you introduce elements of classical metaphysics, it's really hard to eliminate the possibility of explaining the world in light of God and the spiritual soul capable through abstraction of knowing and analyzing the causal elements of the world in universal terms. So there's a kind of catch-22, I believe, for the theory that mind is ultimately reducible to matter or can even be eliminated from a scenario of ultimate explanation. I don't like that. I mean,
I don't like that either.
just intellectually, I don't like it. I don't like it intellectually, independently of my own,
Sounds bad,
theistic
right?
beliefs.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, Father. I think that's right. It's a good point. Not to get too sidetracked into another book, but I was just revisiting Lloyd Gerson's Naturalism and Philosophy, I think is the title of it, right? And his whole case is that if you're a consistent naturalist, right, this you have a package deal here between these commitments of nominalism and mechanism and skepticism and relativism, and you can't just say you break away with one and still call yourself really a consistent naturalist, right? And so he thinks that for philosophy to even be possible, you actually have to reject all that stuff wholesale, and you have to be a big tent Platonist. But then, of course, that just sets you right on the path to classical theism, right?
Yeah, well, okay, so on that, there is a segue to the evil issue because one of the things we come to know as we come to know things is that there are degrees of perfection in the realization of them. I mean, this is just true for biological realities as they mature. A more perfect, mature horse, a more mature and perfect canine, or a more mature and perfect human being who's a scientific mathematician. We grade people on their mathematic exploits. Right. So gradations of perfection and good realizations of biological, psychic, and let's just call it intellectual, rational, moral health are part and parcel of the way we make sense of reality. And this is why, to speak of Plato, the intuitions of the Gorgias seem to remain pertinent, that the problem of justice, the problem of good human action, cannot be reduced to simply a problem of the arrangement of material elements in a human being. We're going to have to evaluate acts as ordered toward morally loving and good recognition of the let's call it the dignity or the nobility of another person, in allowing them what is their due and in engaging with them in a way that's according to virtue, disposed towards civic friendship. It seems like justice is a part of every department of biology, chemistry, and physics in the way it actually works concretely, and of every philosophy department in the way it is either functional or dysfunctional. And academics get quite animated around issues of justice, but metaphysically, it seems like to talk about justice, you do have to talk about ontological realizations of the good or the lack thereof, including in qualitative moral action. Now, Aquinas argues in the beginning of the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, that just because there is such a thing as evil, both natural and moral evil, let's say, in the world as privation of the good, there is actuation of realities in degrees of perfection as less or more good. And because there is objectively goodness in the world, according to degrees of perfection, it seems incumbent on us to explain it by an ultimate causal measure of goodness, which then invites us to think rationally about the existence of God as well as the providential governance of created reality. So, I mean, there is a way to, I think, in a quite honest and not mischievous intellectual way, turn the whole question around and say, isn't it true that just because there is evil, we must affirm the existence of God? Because if there is evil as the privation of good, then there is ontological goodness. And if there's a scale and degree of perfections in things according to realizations of goodness, then there's got to be some explanation of that that is mind independent. And if there's a mind independent explanation of ontological goodness, it would seem it has to be some cause that's giving goodness to all things, and it can't just be the material compilation that's actuating that. That's got to be
Yeah.
have something to do with form and finality. Yeah, now we're back in form and nature and teleology, and it seems like now we're in the intelligibility and final ultimate ends of things, and we're back in a theistic ontological classical picture of the world. I don't know how to make sense of evil myself, really, without some kind of picture like that. So
Yeah.
I tend to the view that the evil is very real, and it's really, really tough, and it's
Right.
horrific in some ways, but it also opens the vista towards the idea of sovereign good.
Yeah. Really good thoughts there, Father. That's sort of a metaphysical moral argument. I want to explore that for a minute. Because even if, and I think the theist does have to maintain some sort of privation theory of evil. I just don't see what other sort of theory would be consistent with theism. Thankfully, I think that theory can be well defended. But of course, it's still legitimate for the skeptic to ask. We say, even if evil was a do good gone missing, then why did God create a world with so many holes in it? Right? And so it's sort of a separate issue. But just to come back to that interesting moral argument you made, do you think that is that just the de ente argument, right? So if we have this convertibility thesis of goodness and being or goodness and actuality, and we draw this distinction between any particular finite thing and its actual active existence or the degree of perfection it has, right? What I'm asking is it just do all these sort of moral arguments just sort of bleed into the cosmological argument from a different perspective at the end of the day, right? Where we say, okay, these things have being by participation. Their nature, the essence, does not demand or guarantee their inclusion or goodness, right? In reality, so then we're sort of on this causal hunt, right, for this primary source of being or goodness, and to sort of terminate that hunt for explanation. We're going to have to kind of eventually land at something whose essence just is its being or just is its goodness, and that's sort of what you're, I think, maybe gesturing at as the maximum. Is that how you're thinking about it, or do you see these things as actually really distinct
Which things?
forms of argument? Say
Oh,
that's sort of maybe the fourth way, and
yeah.
Aquinas is de ente. Do you see them as really just standalone arguments, or do you see them as really the same argument, but maybe with just like a privileged or unique path into that argument?
Yeah, I argue they're distinct. I think they
Okay.
are distinct. I think you can argue about the existence issue independently of how uh, you how you think about the goodness or the lack thereof, or the scale of being and perfection, the scale of degrees of perfection and goodness and beauty in the world. And I think you can argue from the teleological arguments, like the fifth way of Aquinas, distinct from the fourth way, because I think the problem of degrees of perfection is a sort of like different question than the intelligibility of ends, because I think people and animals and plants all clearly do pursue ends that they don't give themselves or that they don't choose, such as the desire of the human being to find the truth or live in happiness, which I think is unavoidable and inextinguishable. And we didn't choose it. That's just part of our rational nature. So, I think there's things like that for animal life in terms of nutrition and reproduction and things like that, and vegetable life. And okay, but I even think you can extend it reasonably to non-living realities insofar as they kind of have a stubbornness of form and exert kind of, let's just say, habitual properties and effects. So I don't think it's crazy to talk about teleology at the non-living level. So I think that kind of intelligibility of perfective form or form unto perfection that tends towards certain ends is a little bit different than the question of scales of perfection. And the scales of perfection is definitely different from you might say, the causal givenness of being or existing, and the sort of givenness of essences. But it's true too that, I mean, the arguments all can be read as complementary to one another, and in some sense, they do obviously converge, not just in terms of the conclusion about the existence of God the Creator, but also certain ways of thinking about the Creator that are convergent as conclusions of each argument. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with the saying that those are distinct. And then, I think also the arguments I provide, or like try to provide, from immaterial acts of the soul, from immaterial elements of human thought and volition that indicate immateriality of human volitional faculties and intellectual faculties, themselves implying an immaterial substrate, that we have spiritual souls. This is a kind of Aristotelio-Thomist approach to immateriality of human faculties, and therefore of the substantial form of the human person, the soul, as subsistent and immaterial. Obviously, that in a way leads you also to the claims about theism, because we're not the authors of our own being, and we clearly haven't always existed. But if we have spiritual immaterial forms of life that are personal, we come from something personal and transcendent, we know not what. So, I think that that's just another way of approaching God too.
Yeah, the cumulative case. Okay, that's really interesting. So just to, I agree. I think the fifth way definitely is a distinct argument from the other ones that I've been countenancing. But the fourth way, I have to say, to get to the maximum, I always thought maybe the fourth way should be read as sort of privileging into the de ente and the real distinction, because then I think you can just ride the de ente to that being that just is
Yeah.
subsistent existence. But if you're not thinking about the de ente, then how do you get to that maximum, right? From maybe your understanding of the fourth way. So, like, hey, there's degrees of tallness. Does that mean there's a maximally tall person, or what's
Yeah.
Dawkins' famous "the stinkiest stinker" or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my way of making the fourth way work was always just to blend it into the de ente. But I don't
Yeah.
think that's what you're thinking about.
Well,
So
that's a very, that's a very uh, there is a kind of pedigree to that move, right? So that
mhm.
the person in the 20th century who really first advised that strategy is Van Steenbergen at Leuven, and he influenced, for example, Monsignor John Whipple, who does this in his famous and large
That's
tome.
right. I've got Whipple in mind for sure. Yeah. Mhm.
Um, and I think there's there's a kind of eminence to that approach. But what? So what I think is that there's part of the reason the fourth way is so counterintuitive for us after um, the rise of, let's say, just modern materialism, or the new atomism that we are all educated in through the modern sciences, which has a certain kind of degree of legitimacy, of course, but leads just to a kind of a metaphysical imagination of a kind, is that it's hard for us to think about form. I mean, I don't mean figure, like the imaginative figure of how we think of the stance of a man in a picture, but I mean the nature that seems to be consistent throughout, like, say, all the stages of life from childhood to mature adulthood of a human being. There's always
Right.
one nature, natural form. Um, but you can have perfections in form and in formal quality that are not reducible just to material states. I mean, we judge who should be the first violinist in the New York Philharmonic, or we judge who got the best grade on the exam in physics in a class, and for what reason, and we quantify it by a degree of excellence that we denote through a quantitative measure. But it's not a quantitative thing, right? It's a quality, really, a degree of quality. But we can also then think about properties that enter into all things that aren't things like odor or material, individuated material perfections, but that are, you might say, more universal, like existence, or intelligence, or intelligibility, or beauty, or goodness. And now those are analogical concepts, so getting a kind of content to them takes a little work, because the goodness of a human person, or the truthfulness of a human person in the moral or intellectual domain, is different than, we say, the goodness of let's just say, a solar system, and the intelligibility of a solar system. But there is some kind of common, differentiated, analogically realization, common realization of goodness and intelligibility, differentiated in analogical ways across a spectrum of beings. And that notion of goodness or truth doesn't have to be reduced to a material element that would be incapable of explaining all of reality. Okay, so then the problem is this: there is this diversity of forms, a scale of forms, diverse forms. We find ourselves in it. You can't say, oh, I'm the author of the judgment regarding all of human actions as more or less good, or the relationship between the goodness of a human community and the goodness of a solar system, whatever that might mean. But I think it does probably mean something once we chase it out. We didn't author all that, and neither did the solar system. So we're in this world of the scale and differentiation of forms according to degrees of perfection, and we are not the author of it. But then if there is an author of it that isn't just the material substrate, which doesn't make any sense as an explanation, it's got to be something transcendent of being, goodness, truth, and beauty that is itself authoring the scale of forms, but can't be itself just another finite form in the scale. So, I mean, I think it's a peculiar kind of argument, but I do think it can have a soft and yet real demonstrable viability to say something is authoring the scale of perfection in forms that's not itself within the finite register of the scale.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So I guess maybe my follow-up question to that would be coming back, moving away from any of the particular traditional arguments for God is what sort of theoretical advantages you think classical theism might be able to afford concerning ultimate explanation or intelligibility, and to kind of gesture at what I'm getting at. I think classical theism, for example, can give us a worldview where we don't have any brute facts, where we have something that is really relevantly different, right, from all the sorts of things of the world that just seem like really bad candidates to be an ultimate, independent, self-sufficient reality. And it strikes me that we're not just looking for a necessary being, and St. Thomas was hip to this, right, because he totally understood that certain beings could be necessary yet still dependent upon some deeper cause or principle. We're looking for true ultimacy, independence, self-sufficiency. And classical theism seems sort of uniquely positioned within, and I think this is important, within its metaphysical system, to sort of cash out ultimate intelligibility, because we have this entity that we would argue for metaphysical reasons is uniquely unique, insofar as its essence just is its existence. So that's kind of a nice result. It seems like, okay, we have something whose nature just is to be, so we kind of get that necessary existence. It's non-multipliable. It's not even appropriate to ask why this thing exists once we kind of conceptually understand it. It's very relevantly different from all the things that seem to require outside explanation, mutable things, finite things, things that come into being, right? And that's so it seems to me like, just theoretically, like if anything could serve as a sort of ultimate explainer, the thing that could explain everything else and even explain itself, not cause itself, like that sort of thing seems to be the only candidate in town, right? Like I really can't think of anything else that could do it. But then even downstream from that, I think we get a lot more explanatory juice to it. You hinted at these degrees of perfection. Like it does seem like it could make sense of that phenomena as well, the human person, which maybe we'll talk about here, the moral dimension. But of course, along for the ride is that wide, it's not just God, right? It's God within a wider metaphysical system. Does that make sense what I'm kind of getting at? If so, I'd love to hear
Yeah,
your
yeah.
thoughts on it.
I mean, I just to add to the litany before I say one thing, because I think it's very eloquent what you said. I mean, it also helps you start to think about religion, because the cosmos opens up to religious dimensions, because there's something transcendent that is not just source, but also in a certain way final end, or attractive and good, radiant, drawing, has a radiant and good drawing power on human behavior that can invite us to seek transcendent life with God, and that could explain a lot religiously, as opposed to the kind of masters of suspicion, where you've got to employ weird ideas from Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche to explain why people are religious that seem to derogate from their human nobility and dignity. They might explain some religious pathology, but they can't really explain the deep human longing for transcendent meaning in the face of the beauty and goodness of the world. Anyway, but what you're going toward, I think it's very important, is divine simplicity is the ultimate form of explanation. I mean, this thing that our dear friend Richard Dawkins stumbles upon, which is that the ultimate explanation should be the most simple, and God isn't simple, is a funny thing to say, because of course in classical theism, it is only God that's simple in the most profound sense, and therefore the only thing that can really explain everything, which is exactly what you're pointing at with the absence in God of a real distinction between essence and existence, because God's not downstream in being, and doesn't receive his existence from another, but everything that does exist seems to need some kind of transcendent an explanation in relation to a transcendent origination of both existence and essence or nature. And there are more moves like that, right? Like there's not many gods. There's only one who has the fullness and the perfection of the divine nature. There's only one who is God, who has the divine nature. There's only one God. God is in God. There's no real distinction of developmental or evolutionary property and of essence. So God's not becoming wiser or better by creating the world. He's giving out of the plenitude of a goodness that transcends us and doesn't depend on us. It has no contingency or evolutionary aptitude for potential development. I mean, he's sovereignly, transcendently, and incomprehensibly good. So here's the other thing about that. You're pointing toward the fact that it's the only really ultimately rational and satisfying explanation, precisely because of the transcendent simplicity of God as source of all the else that is. But the other side is that very explanation that is the most rational is also deeply apophatic and mystical.
Yeah.
You can go right through the door of rationality and come out into the room of I would say, completely rationally warranted mysticism.
Hmm.
Because God is not like the zebra or the kangaroo or the pine tree or the star or the human being or the complex human thoughts we have. I mean, there's something transcendent about God that makes him very much unlike the world that he creates. And that makes sense because the world he creates is not God, it's the world that's created. And we're learning of God through creatures. So there's a lot of unlearning when we think about God, and there's a lot of negation, and there's a lot of hiddenness and incomprehensibility. And that may be good because the mind is not satisfied by just what can it master. It seeks to know something that transcends what it can dominate or master. And it seeks to contemplate, to know something that is infinite and eternal and more perfect than anything we find in our world, because we have the kind of mind that can ask questions about God and seek the trace of God in things. That means we have a mind that can be exceedingly rational in explanation, in looking up toward God, and also, without any contradiction to what I just said, a mind open to what is deeply mystical,
Yeah.
apophatic, and contemplative.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Father, and that means a lot to me for several reasons. And you brought up divine simplicity, and I'm with you. I mean, it's for me, it really is sort of divine simplicity or bust for many reasons, but ultimate intelligibility is the big one. And I think it also has other advantages. If you're already a sort of Christian or religious theist, it helps to shore up certain doctrine, like God's ultimacy, aseity, and in principle monotheism, right? If God is just pure esse, then his nature is simple and self-subsistent, right? But then if you were to kind of have multiple instances of that, you would inherently contradict the nature either as simple or self-subsistent, right? So it like kind of locks in from a metaphysical standpoint a very robust monotheism. Like God is
Right.
uniquely unique,
There
right?
can
They're
only
just
be one who's if the universe is explained correctly, and if the universe is explicable, and it is, there's only one God. There can only be one God. There can only be one who is God. And
right.
the other thing is, just to add to that, a little next thought, it helps you with Trinitarian monotheism, because the one God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit revealed in Christ and in the New Testament doctrine of the Church. The one God, the three persons are each the one God, or they possess in their divine simplicity the plenitude of divine existence, essence, and life. So you don't find anything in the Son or the Spirit that's not in the Father, and you don't find anything in the Father that's not in the Son and the Spirit. They are each the one God, and it's more mysterious in a certain way, but it's in no way it's not incoherent first and foremost, but it's also in no way in contradiction to the affirmation of a very fundamental monotheistic view of God based on the claims of divine simplicity, which are the heart of all classical Catholic thinking about the Trinity. There's no classical thought about the Trinity without divine simplicity. That's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people don't understand that, but it's a conditional possibility for thinking rightly about the Trinity, to think about God as, in some real sense, simple.
Yeah, I agree with that. You mentioned Lonergan before, and he's an excellent resource on that. And then, sorry, just to swing back to what I was saying before about the mysticism, because it's such a good point there. Is like when you really think about, as best as we can, the implications of divine simplicity, it entails a lot of really spooky things about God. But I don't think it's not a spookiness to be scared of. I think it's a spookiness to be excited about. Like you have to think about God's knowledge. If we attribute knowledge to God, right? I really like, the idea of Barry Miller, how he draws out God as the limit case instance of something. Where for Miller, he contrasts the idea of a limit case with a limit simpliciter. So take speed, right? Maybe there's a limit simpliciter, the speed of light, the fastest anything can move, right? But for Miller, a limit case is where there's this sort of varying of a certain property within a series of things to the point of extinction, right? But they're converging upon something. So a standstill would be the limit case. It's not itself a speed, but it's clear that that's where the series is converging. And he argues this is how we should think about God. It's the limit case instance of being, of goodness, of knowledge, of intellection. But that means that God is not itself within those categories, right? There's a similarity. He defends analogy, but it really helps to open up this profound otherness of God, which is a very spookiness. You think of knowledge, right? All of our knowledge is in some sense passive. Even our active knowledge, like the fact that I know that I'm talking to you right now, itself presupposes a passive knowledge that I know that you exist and there's a computer here and this or that, where Miller will say, well, no, all of God's knowledge is entirely active. We have no idea what that is, right? But also because he's simple, it's non-propositional, right? So
For
it
sure.
starts to get really spooky where we think, well,
Well,
what is that like, right? But I
it's
think that's a good thing because it
yeah.
at least shows that there's this other mode of knowing and being that is not like ours, which to me strikes me as radically insufficient. If the only other like way of being is just like a more maxed out instance of what we have, like a
Yeah,
higher degree of ours,
right.
that strikes me as radically insufficient on many fronts. Sorry, I just threw a lot out there, but
No, I like that. So, to respond to that, I mean, when you say the word spooky, I think of the adjective alienating. So I think there are views of God that are very alienating to us. And where I would go with your comment is to say highly anthropomorphic or anthropomorphized visions of God, conceptual ideas of God. And I find them myself in somewhat like people like Descartes are alienating because it looks like you now need something like a man or a mind or a will just in a more maximal degree of perfection, perhaps not even infinite, or maybe infinite understood as just very powerful, but in the same form or essence as what we find in human beings, now controlling the world. And it looks like you're in a way being controlled by some great angel, or that you think to explain matter or the intelligible arrangement of things you need some forceful mind going and working with the stuff of the universe to keep it in order. I think these are alienating
Mm.
ideas because they don't actually engage with the transcendence of God. That you might say that the transcendent darkness as well as luminousness of God, and instead they imprison us within immanence under the pretension of metaphysical theism, or under the pretension of rational religion. And I think there's a certain kind of alienation from that in some kinds of atheism, sometimes either against Enlightenment theism, animated against Enlightenment theism, or against analytic theism of certain kinds, that is warranted. Basically, your God is all too human, and it looks just like you need a big human being to prop up the universe. As where I think when you get into more classical metaphysical views that are respectful of the incomprehensibility of God, you do have to step out beyond human language at some point and say, well, our language can denote this reality only imperfectly because we have to use created forms and created modes of signification to signify God. Yet we think we can signify God in Aquinas' terms by analogy. Um, and yet also knowing that there's something unsatisfying or ungraspable about God. But that could be okay, because actually that's where the intellect and the will step out into the desire for something even greater than what can be comprehended or modeled after the pattern of our human nature.
Yeah, beautifully said. We could do obviously an entire conversation on divine simplicity, but to me that is the heart of ultimate explanation. I love that you went right to the claim with Trinitarianism, because obviously it's a common objection that these things are incompatible. But for that, I will just point people towards your previous book.
But yeah, I'll just say, the book on the Trinity I wrote, but also just say, like, that's really simple, at least at the beginning. There's a really simple, basic starting point. The divine nature is simple, but there are three persons in the Trinity. We are not claiming there's no distinction of persons. We're just claiming the three persons, really distinct, are each possess the plenitude of the divine nature. And then you have to get into the more complicated, supposed conceptual claim that they're distinct each in virtue of relations of origin and eternal processions of intellectual generation and volitional love. But I mean, I think it's important to say we're not claiming a divine simplicity that excludes distinction of persons. We're claiming a divine simplicity that affirms a unity or singularity of divine nature.
Yes, right. And I think where the proponent of classical theism can go on the offensive there is saying you sort of need divine simplicity to mix here to avoid certain heresies, right? Of like modalism or tripartitism or something like that, right? I think that's right. And then it's also just as a matter of clarification, because it seems to be commonly missed that the classical theist doesn't say that there are no distinctions or real distinctions in God. There's just no distinctions that amount to real composition in God. And then, whether they can succeed in drawing out the distinctions between persons without putting composition in God, of course, is that project, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of forms of divine simplicity. And I think everybody in the Christian tradition, most of the major voices hold to some version of divine simplicity, but then there are actually significant and interesting arguments among classical theists in the Christian and in the other monotheistic Jewish and Muslim traditions about what we mean by divine simplicity.
I will point people also to, it's probably about a year ago, I had a conversation with Dr. James Dolezal on the Trinity and divine simplicity, where we got into this. So I'll point people to that if they want to pursue that line of thought further. So we have a few more minutes here, Father, and there's a lot in the book. We've sort of talked about classical theism and ultimate explanation. I haven't gotten to the section in your book, so I would like to hear a little bit, at least a teaser, of the section on philosophical anthropology, what sort of arguments you deploy for the immateriality of the human person, human soul. And yeah, do you think those that's kind of the point of, I think a lot of traditional philosophers and thinkers will say, yeah, we can argue that there's some immaterial aspect about us, but can we push from there philosophically to an immortal aspect of us?
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see how far you think we can go and what sort of
Well,
arguments
I do think the argument for the immateriality and subsistence after death of the human soul is a lot more difficult than the argument.
It's trickier for sure, yeah.
But, I do kind of just follow the line indicated by Aquinas, derived from his reading of Aristotle, which is to argue that there are certain immaterial acts that are not reducible to the sensate powers, and that they are emitted by and expressive of the faculties of the intellect and will, but only an immaterial faculty can author an immaterial act of knowledge or love. Thus, there are immaterial faculties, but the immaterial faculties are, you might say, housed within or emergent from a substrate, which is the human soul, form of the body. But only an immaterial substrate can give rise to immaterial faculties, which in turn can blossom through immaterial acts. So there must be something immaterial about the soul, or the soul must be actually immaterial itself if it's capable of immaterial faculty of emerging in or expressing itself in emergent faculties of intellect and will, which themselves produce immaterial acts. That's kind of the big idea, and I actually don't spend a lot of time defending that. What I think of the much more difficult thing to defend, actually, in that chain of reasoning is just the first premise of that argument, which is that there are immaterial acts of the intellect or will. So I spend a lot of the time there and argue three arguments from the intellect and one from the will. And they're all Thomistic arguments, and they're in Aquinas. There's also literature about them. They're disputed and controversial, I suppose, but one is from the knowledge of the universal, one is from the capacity to grasp the form of a thing. That's to say, to know what a thing is in itself formally, you might say, above and beyond its individual material individuating properties. And then the third is from the self-reflexivity of the mind, able to know itself even as it knows a reality other than itself, to be present within itself, so to speak, in its act of knowing. And then the last argument is from the self-reflexivity or self-referentiality of the will, which is able to choose from, we might say, within intellection, goods of reason, and thus is conformed to the immateriality of the intellect in the way we freely choose things. It's very hard to explain free will as free will if there isn't an immaterial element to free will. And it seems like the sort of capacity of the will to love its own freedom and to choose intellectually from contrary objects involves a kind of immaterial dimension. So I think that's actually probably the most difficult argument to make, because the will's like less luminous to us than the intellect. But anyway, from those four arguments, I then try to say, well, okay, like we are producing immaterial acts. They are the fruit of faculties that are doing immaterial things. They must be immaterial faculties, and they are rooted in an immaterial substrate. So the substrate isn't the formal substrate of the human person. Producing the personal actions of knowledge and love is not itself a material substrate. So it isn't corrupted by death. And we don't know, we can't say that we know that we are not, we know we're created. We know we're finite in being. So it must be a personal reality that, in some sense, analogically speaking, that gives rise to spiritual personhood in us. And there must be some personalistic destiny to the soul after death, or at least it seems highly fitting to believe that there is or would be. So, I mean, these are aggressive claims, they're strong claims philosophically, but they're not historically rare claims. I mean, they're like just precedent for them.
Yeah, I mean, you find it even in the pagans, like Aristotle and stuff like that. And speaking
Oh,
of, I
yeah.
had a
Well,
conversation.
yeah,
Yeah,
whether Aristotle believes that you as an individual soul, I mean, I think that's Aquinas has a good reading of Aristotle as positing individual, immaterial soul. But, that's the famous question of other interpretations of Aristotle. But certainly, obviously, in the Platonists, I mean, Plato, Porphyry, I think Plotinus, the soul has some kind of subsistence after death, and it's in many medieval philosophers of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian derivation.
yeah. I mean, the other question here is like, well, how much can we prove, and I guess how much do we need to prove, depending on what sort of debate we're having, right? So, I mean, if we're arguing and having a nice back and forth with a sort of reductive naturalist, I mean, if you just can have a forceful argument, there's some immaterial aspect of us, whether that survives bodily death, and that's not something that any naturalist should be happy with, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
itself is a very significant worldview conclusion, right? It seems like that latter, claim that we survive death.
Could,
That's I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody would
That's that.
say somebody would just say that's revealed by God. That's certainly a standard move you could make.
Mhm.
Um, we certainly don't have any philosophical experience of life, of the soul apart from the body. Um, and the most you could say is that you think there's epistemically important information happening in near-death experience, which is hugely contested in Catholic theology, and there's no
I know.
common
Yeah.
position. There's no
Mhm.
common position on that. So yeah, I mean, but then you could argue that given what the form of the soul is, and given that you can exclude from it the power of the possibility of material corruption, that there's something about it that's as you used the phrase earlier, there's something about necessary about it. It's not a purely contingent reality. So there's no reason to posit that from the corruption of the body, it would follow that the soul would be corrupted. In fact, there seems to be compelling reasons to think that the immateriality of the soul is such that it would continue to subsist unless God were to. It would only cease to subsist if God were to withdraw his creative act, and there's no real reason to think he would annihilate the soul just because the body has died.
Yeah, yeah, great, Father. Thank you so much. Obviously, we just sort of scratched the surface of some very deep and important considerations in philosophical anthropology and the nature of the human person, which of course gives us reason to encourage people to grab your new book here. Let's see if I can get it on screen. It is called Principles of Catholic Theology, Book 2, on the rational credibility of. Yeah, please. Yeah, you hold up. There it is. Great, great. Really, really just lovely. Is this Catholic University Press? I didn't look at the.
Yeah, Catholic
Yeah.
University. Yeah.
Always do such a nice job. Where's the best place that people can grab a copy of this? Just Amazon or the usual
Well,
outlets, or
then maybe have people have different moral
Feed the Monster?
sensibilities
Yeah.
about where you get your books, but I think Amazon is still popular, and it's
Yeah.
definitely accessible.
Yeah. Well, I'll be sure to put the links in the show notes and encourage people to grab that. I also want to recommend. I remember we had a conversation a few years back. I don't know if you remember it, but it was many years back. You had that wonderful, wonderful book come out, "The Light of Christ," and that is still one of the first books that I recommend to anybody who's just sort of interested in Catholicism. It's just so well done. It's just such a great introduction. So I want to make sure that I remind people of that, to pick up a copy of that. And then before we go, what else are you working on? You gave us a little tease, but yeah, just
I have
what do
a
we
I have
have to look
a
forward to from you in the
I
future?
have a book coming out. I wouldn't pretend it's I think that Light of Christ book is, I mean, I do think that book's a little bit better than some of the books I've written, although the book on the
We
Trinity
all
is
have
like
our personal favorites, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
the book on the Trinity is a very important book. This book, I think, has a lot in it. I mean, I really think I put a lot into this book that I have not been able to say as well or forcefully elsewhere. But I have a book on the contemplative life, or really on the spiritual life, that's coming out as a kind of companion volume to The Light of Christ, called Contemplation and the Cross, um, and a theological introduction to the Catholic spiritual life. And that will be a kind of Thomistic analysis of what grace is and what grace can do in us, to conform us to the mystery of Jesus and the mystery of the Trinity, and through the sacraments, the interior life of prayer. And there's stuff on there on Mariology and the theological virtues, kind of how to live the spiritual life in light of the teaching of St. Thomas. That's coming
Yeah.
out probably in the late part of this year or early next year.
Okay, great. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to get you back on for another conversation at some point, Father. So really, really appreciate it. Really appreciate the work you're doing, and this has been a joy. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. I'm really grateful.